Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking the absolutely fascinating history of how the world's premier World War II intelligence service was systematically dismantled. If you've ever wondered how the tides of war can turn not just on weapons, but on communication, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to be looking at a clash of systems, a clash of philosophies, and ultimately a massive clash of cultures.
Picture this. It's 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, D-Day. A 23-year-old Comanche named Larry Sawpitty hits the wet sand of Utah Beach, powers up his radio, and transmits that they made a good landing but in the wrong place. But he doesn't say it in English. He says it in Comanche. Now imagine you're a highly trained German intelligence operator sitting in a quiet bunker west of Paris trying to evaluate this. You're hearing a language with rhythmic, guttural, lightning-fast sounds that conform to literally no linguistic system you have ever studied. It was total, paralyzing confusion.
So, here's the big question for us today. How did an intelligence apparatus that easily cracked Polish, French, and British communications suddenly hit an absolute brick wall with the Americans? The German forces had cracked Czech codes in hours, Polish orders in days, and they mapped entire Soviet movements just from ambient radio chatter. Yet when the Americans arrived, the German radio operators eventually just threw up their hands. Why did that happen?
To put the scale of this into perspective, think about the number 12,000. That is the staggering number of highly trained German troops whose sole dedicated job was to listen to and decode enemy traffic. They had massive resources, they were incredibly competent. In fact, Germany's chief of army signals noted that early in the war, American nets were pretty cooperative and easy to intercept. But soon, the Americans unknowingly built 5 distinct, completely impenetrable walls.
Wall number 1, the invisible frequencies.
The first barrier the Americans threw up was literally the wall of physics. You see, engineer Daniel Noble convinced the U.S. military to adopt frequency modulation, or FM, for their tactical radios. Because FM travels strictly via line of sight, the signals just stop at the horizon. They never reach the German intercept station sitting 60 miles behind the front lines. The tactical chatter just vanished into thin air.
Before FM came along, a German operator could easily tune in to those vulnerable, long-range AM waves that bounce right off the ionosphere to map out an entire battlefield. But the Americans started mass-producing over 130,000 FM handy-talkies for their infantry. Almost overnight, American infantry chatter went from loud and visible to entirely invisible.
Moving right along to wall number 2, the language of chaos.
For any of those longer-range operational frequencies that still had to rely on AM, the Germans could still intercept the signals, but here they crashed into our second wall. Total, absolute linguistic chaos. The Germans had trained their university-educated English specialists on formal British procedures, highly disciplined, grammatically structured, completely predictable. But they had zero model to parse decentralized American slang. The U.S. Army basically took factory workers, farmers, and boys from the Louisiana Bayou, threw them on a radio net, and just said, "Talk."
Just imagine being a German linguist who spent 4 years at Heidelberg University studying Shakespeare, and you're trying to extract tactical value from a chaotic sentence spoken by a 20-year-old from Brooklyn. They'd call a machine gun a chatterbox, a tank a bucket, or use totally improvised acronyms like FUBAR or SNAFU. This wasn't a mathematical code, this was a culture, and a rigid, grammatical mind simply cannot decrypt an entirely foreign culture.
Which brings us to wall number 3, the fire hose of volume.
Even if a brilliant German operator somehow managed to figure out the regional slang and the baseball metaphors, they were immediately crushed by the overwhelming industrial scale of American radio traffic. Right before the Normandy invasion even started, the Americans were transmitting an industrial flood of 1.5 to 2 million cipher groups every single day. The German intelligence system, which was beautifully designed to handle dozens or maybe hundreds of daily messages, was suddenly forced to try and drink from a literal fire hose.
The German intelligence cycle was this incredibly rigid 5-step process. They had to intercept the message, then transcribe it, decrypt it, evaluate its worth, and finally forward it to command. But because Americans operated so relentlessly fast, this cycle just took way too long. A message intercepted at 8 a.m. about an American battalion moving might get processed by noon. But by noon, the Americans were already long gone. The intercepted information was dead history by the time it actually reached a German general.
All right, on to wall number 4, unwritten languages.
This wall leveraged something entirely unique to the diverse heritage of the United States. You see, a mathematical cipher follows set rules and algorithms, so it's inherently breakable with enough time and logic.
But the unwritten, living languages of the Native American code talkers offered absolutely zero entry point for analysis. Japanese and German intelligence had actually tried to study these languages before the war, but without published dictionaries or standard European cognates, it was just an impossible task without total cultural immersion.
The Army brought in young Comanche men to build a literal code inside a code at Fort Benning. So not only were they speaking a wildly complex indigenous language, but they were using incredibly specialized terminology. Bombers became pregnant birds, bombs were baby birds, tanks were turtles, machine guns were sewing machines, and Adolf Hitler was simply the crazy white man. A standard cipher machine back then took 4 hours to decode a message. A Comanche code talker did it in under 3 minutes. And the craziest part, the Germans never even recognized it as a language to begin with.
Finally, we hit wall number 5, the two locks.
This was a purely mathematical barrier that totally challenged the German cryptographic philosophy. The American strategy was entirely pragmatic. They used a fast, highly portable, and, eventually breakable machine called the M209 for tactical battlefield orders. They completely knew it could be broken, but by the time the Germans cracked it, the orders were old news anyway. But for the really strategic secrets, like General Eisenhower's personal communications, they used Sagaba. This was a 100-pound absolute beast of a machine with 15 rotors, famously guarded by a 40-pound thermite charge designed to melt the whole thing at 1400 degrees if it was ever in danger of being captured. The Germans couldn't even put a scratch on Sagaba.
So, let's pull all this together into the synthesis, a clash of cultures. When you step back and look at these 5 distinct walls, the physics of FM radio silence, the unpredictable slang, the crushing industrial volume, the indigenous code talkers, and the split between strategic and tactical ciphers, they all share one really profound foundation. In his exhaustive 600-page post-war report, German General Albert Prawn documented every single one of these technical hurdles. But if you read between the lines, he was circling around a truth that he just couldn't quite bring himself to accept.
And here's that ultimate takeaway. American communications couldn't be decoded because they weren't just a system, they were a messy, decentralized culture. The German military was built top to bottom on strict order and highly centralized control, and they naturally expected everyone else to act the exact same way. But the American military trusted a 22-year-old kid sitting in a muddy foxhole to make judgment calls on the radio. A rigid hierarchical intelligence apparatus simply could not model a free, diverse, and heavily decentralized society.
Let's take a quick look at the aftermath. Before we wrap up, we really need to highlight the quiet, delayed, yet monumental pride of the brave individuals behind these innovations. Men like Charles Chibity, the very last Comanche code talker who passed away in 2005. It's wild to think that these men went to government boarding schools that actively tried to suppress their native languages and their culture, yet those exact surviving languages literally saved the free world. Their service was classified for decades, which means they went back to living ordinary lives at home, completely unable to tell anyone how vital their words were on the beaches of Normandy.
Which leaves us with a totally fascinating question to ponder as we close out this explainer. When we look at the pure silence of FM radios, the wild slang of young soldiers, the massive industrial output, the unbreakable living indigenous languages, and the brilliant pragmatic cipher strategy, it really makes you wonder. Could the chaotic, decentralized, and diverse nature of a free society actually be its most impenetrable defense? It's definitely something to think about the next time you consider what actually keeps a nation secure. Thanks so much for learning with us today.